Ahhh, bonjour. My name is Sherry Telford, and I would like to welcome everyone to our TRC Bobcaygeon gathering today. It's June 8th, 2020, and we certainly find ourselves in unusual times. We are gathering together online rather than in person because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we keep ourselves physically separated from one another, we can't help but be aware of the turbulence around and even within us. People have taken to the streets across Turtle Island and beyond to voice their frustration, their demands, and the overall sentiment that enough is enough, or rather that it's already been far too much, the racism, too much indifference, and too much denial of the violence and injustices in our societies. And in the midst of this, we are gathering to share our humble stories of relationship and reconciliation. We do so on the lands and waters of the Michisagi Anishinaabe, in the territory that they have lived on, cared for, and defended since time immemorial. As a settler, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, to live here, and to share in the beauty and the gifts of the Kawarthas. Chimigwech to these lands and waters, to all the life found here, and to the Michisagi Anishinaabe for sharing and for their continued care. Now, Sherry Hillman will introduce our honored guest and the special initiative that has brought us here today.
This is the story of Truth and Reconciliation Community Bobcaygeon's Quilted banner. Through the individual stories of each quilt square, it tells the story of our group of settlers as we learn and work together towards reconciliation in respectful relationship with our Indigenous neighbors and friends. This quilted banner was inspired by Alice Williams, elder, knowledge keeper, and renowned quilter from Curve Lake First Nation. Alice also chairs the Kawartha Truth and Reconciliation Support Group. With her guidance, they created a beautiful reconciliation quilt, which they use as a teaching tool to discuss the painful and tragic era of residential schools and its legacy. Alice brought their quilt to Bobcaygeon last summer for a workshop our group hosted, and we were so inspired by it and the conversations and understanding it fostered that we decided to create our own. Here's Alice to tell us a little more.
Bonjour, Menachem Quaindishnikas, Namexabing and Donji, Aja Dash, Anonymate Nashini should be born in Daya Oma, Skigiman Gajin Gadeg. I said that my Anishinaabe name is Menajimukwe. I come from Trout Lake in northwestern Ontario, and I have lived in Curve Lake now for 51 years. Thank you for asking me to be a part of this group and to talk a little bit about the Kawartha Truth and Reconciliation Support Group Quilt. We made this quilt to express how we felt when we found out about about what happened to people when they went to residential school. So it really is a story about their feelings. So what I'll do is I'll start by reading 3 of the stories in the quilt. The first one is by Ken Purdon. I had a life-altering experience in 1949 when I was 18 years old. I had taken training to be a camp counselor and was sent by the church as a caravaner to Camp Lorraine in Northern Ontario. I was assigned to a cabin of boys between 10 and 12 years old. 4 of the boys in my group were Métis, wards of the Children's Aid. They were in foster homes on farms and were at camp for a much-needed holiday. On the first night, as the boys were preparing for bed, I saw a boy's bare back, which was covered in angry-looking welts. To my dismay, I learned he was regularly beaten if the farmer was not satisfied with his work. He was also called a dirty half-breed. That was my first experience of severe prejudice. I was unable to truly believe that there were people who could be so cruel to a child. Ever since, I have been learning about the experiences of Aboriginal people. I look for ways to confront and to overcome prejudice and to make things better. My second story is by Murray Wheaton, and he's an elder here in Curve Lake, and he has been also our pastor. A friend of mine from Alderville, John Lukes, told me this story about his friend at his funeral. He did the eulogy for his friend, and this is what he said. As he grew up at the residential school in Chapleau, the friend was the one whose job it was to take the team of horses and go and get groceries from the town. On his way back to the school, he would hide meat in the bush. At night, he would take his buddies to the spot and they would build a fire and cook up the meat. Then they'd sneak back into the school afterwards. The next block is by Brenda Higgins, and it's called Quilt of Recognition. My block is a log cabin which represents the homes from which the children were removed. The center portrays the broken hearts of both parents and children. Now I'd like to pass it on to Glenna, who will talk about the Truth and Reconciliation quilt that the Bobcaygeon group made.
Thank you, Alice. Anand Boju. My square, showing the 2-row wampum belt and the words friendship, peace, and forever, is meant to illustrate that by looking into the past, we will find the future for truth and reconciliation. In 1613, the 2-row wampum belt was created to signify an important agreement. The Haudenosaunee leaders and the Dutch government worked out how they would treat each other and live together on Turtle Island. The principles of friendship, peace, and forever were the key criteria of this treaty and all others to follow from the perspective of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. The white and purple wampum shells used by the Haudenosaunee to create the 2-row wampum belt sealed the agreement and those principles. The understanding was that each nation would respect the other's ways. This agreement would be in place until the end of time. The 2-row wampum treaty is a living treaty. It is as relevant to the Indigenous nations today as it was in 1613 to the Haudenosaunee. The treaty premised to honor and respect First Nations, Métis, and Inuit traditions and cultures has been grossly violated many times over by encroaching populations to Turtle Island. The time has come to recognize and honor the principles of the 2-row wampum treaty. We are all people of this treaty and every other treaty that has followed over the centuries. Jay Miigwech. Our next speaker is Sherry Hillman.
My quilt square is about our relationship with Manoomin, or wild rice as it's better known. I chose this theme because Manoomin is central to Truth and Reconciliation Community Bobcaygeon's history, especially its creation story and my own motivation in helping found the group. In 2015, a conflict erupted on Pigeon Lake when lakeshore property owners were discovered ripping Manoomin out of the lake with the permission of Parks Canada, without consultation and in violation of Williams Treaty First Nations rights. Much of the cottagers' anger was directed against Indigenous harvesters from Curve Lake First Nation. The conflict was fanned by a group, Safe Pigeon Lake, who saw Manoomin as a weed that reduced their property values and impeded their ability to enjoy the lake, not understanding its importance to the ecosystem and to the Anishinaabe people. We realized we had to do something to diffuse the conflict and defend Indigenous harvesting rights. So we called a meeting, and that's how TRC Bobcaygeon got started. Although our work has touched on many issues since that founding meeting, Manoomin has remained central to our work, including harvesting with the Black Duck Wild Rice Indigenous harvesters, presenting the play Cottagers and Indians written about this conflict, participating in Parks Canada's workshop on Manoomin, and with Community Voices for Manoomin, organizing 4 ceremonial paddles that corresponded with the stages of Manoomin's life cycle. These ceremonial paddles had a profound effect on me, deepening my relationship to Manoomin, especially with elders and knowledge keepers Dorothy Taylor and Shirley Williams, sharing their stories and songs about the importance of Manoomin to the Anishinaabe people as a sustaining and nutritious food source, but more importantly, culturally and spiritually as central to their migration story, connecting them to their land. So my square symbolizes our work around Manoomin and all the wonderful relationships created doing this work. Next up is Drew. Welcome.
Bojo Anin. I have lived in the Kawarthas for more than 30 years. I have watched those wild places that I love get crowded away by development. People seem to want to dig out the wetlands that support the wildlife, birds, fish, amphibians, and mammals that the natural state of the Kawarthas has supported in abundance. A landscaped shoreline, pristine but sterile, seems to appeal to some of the people who have moved up from the city. After years of complaining and doing nothing, someone convinced me that the best way to protect the Kawarthas from overdevelopment was through supporting the treaty and inherent rights of the Mishi-Sagig people as affirmed by the Williams Treaty settlement. And that involvement has led to an enrichment of my life that I didn't anticipate. The Mishi-Sagig people have given me the gifts of their culture and their friendship, and I have learned how much more effective I can be as the member of a team. My square evokes the canoe and paddle, a machine of simple design refined to a state of perfection. Any canoe that paddles well is a descendant of the birch bark canoe. The technology is dependent on living in the north, woods where birch trees grow large. One cannot build a dugout canoe that is as light and as fleet. And as much as I have learned the fire to the Mishi-Sagig people is a symbol of transformation. In the ceremonies in which I participated, sacred plants are transformed into smoke, and fire heats the rocks that are referred to as grandfathers, which are the vehicles of the transformation that occurs within the sweat lodge. Miigwech and I would like to introduce you to Brenda.
Thank you. I chose my theme to celebrate water, and in particular to honor Indigenous women who have led the sacred water walks in Ontario and elsewhere. Grandmother Josephine Manoomin began these ceremonial walks here in 2003 and walked close to 20,000 kilometers around all 5 of the Great Lakes to raise awareness of the need to protect water and encourage humanity to rekindle its sacred relationship with water. Sadly, Josephine passed away in February 2019, but her great niece, Autumn Peltier, has come forward. And in 2018, Autumn called on all countries at the United Nations to warrior up in the fight for clean water for Indigenous peoples. In the Kawarthas, we have Indigenous women like elders Shirley Williams and Dorothy Taylor to guide us on the water walks in this region and lead us in the ceremonies which give thanks to water for sustaining our lives. Today, it is a crime that in Canada, over 100 First Nations communities are currently affected by drinking water advisories. The forces of colonization and genocide have worked to destroy Indigenous communities and diminish the role of Indigenous women as keepers of the water. Access to clean water is imperative. As part of TRC Bobcaygeon, I commit to working towards correcting this injustice and building on our relationship with water and those who walk for the water. I hope this quilt block will encourage you to appreciate the role of Indigenous women in protecting water for all of us to enjoy. Miigwech, and now welcome to Rodney.
Miigwech. Brenda. So my neighbor Joanne Mudd put this image on cloth. It's an important poster advertising the Drew Hayden Taylor play around Manoomin. I have a wonderful memory of cottagers and Indians being performed in Curve Lake, and I think it was the first time the play was performed outside of Toronto, and the first time the dock had been built in a new location. So beads of sweat, using dead cordless drills as screwdrivers, and borrowing scrap lumber from Curve Lake community members to ensure the dock would hold together, all under a very tight timeline, made for a very memorable debut. It was quite the way for me to meet some members of my new United Church congregation, just beginning the process of moving from a ministry in Bobcaygeon to one in Curve Lake. And I'm so glad that the church could join with labor unions and the arts community, as well as the Curve Lake community, to bring this play home to the Curve Lake Community Center. The next few days of sold-out performances at the Lakeview Arts Barn proved just as memorable. Evening shows were followed by conversation with Michi-Saugig knowledge keepers, and matinees for high school students were complemented by workshops at Gaming Nature Center, just next door on Pigeon Lake, overlooking the wild rice beds. It was there that Drew Hayden Taylor captured students' imaginations with the power of his story, while tasty Manoomin was shared around an open fire, while learning about how Manoomin grows and is processed, and Miigwech to James and Damon Wheatung for their role in this. It felt like we were bringing people together in a good way, having conversation, learning together, and having fun. It really felt we were making a difference. Now I'd like to pass it over to Sherry Telford.
Okay, so this quilt block represents some of the key lessons I've learned so far in my reconciliation journey. I became involved with TRC Bobcaygeon when members of the group participated in my research on how settler Canadians engaging in reconciliation efforts can ensure that what we're doing looks and feels like reconciliation from Indigenous perspectives. The most important lesson I learned from the research, thanks to my friend and mentor Liz Stone from Aamjiwnaang First Nations, is that reconciliation requires relationship, heartfelt, caring, and messy relationship. Relationship is what holds us together, and lack of relationship keeps us apart. On this block, the circle and the mirror represent Indigenous and settler people and communities. The green background represents the beautiful lands we all live on, and the blue represents the water that sustains us. And for the purpose of this visual, it represents what separates us. The medicine wheel is on the top left corner, symbolizes the Anishinaabe medicine wheel teaching shared by Nicole Bell of Kitigan-Zibi First Nations. It reminds us that when we learn with more than just our mind. We also learn with our body, spirit, and hearts. Indigenous learning is also based on the 4 R's of responsibility, respect, relationship, and reciprocity. By ignoring these teachings and these values, we allow racism and injustice to continue. The lower right corner is the settler's mirror. This mirror reminds us that as we engage in reconciliation, we need to look at ourselves. When we look in the mirror of Indigenous teachings and perspectives, we see the reality of how settler society appears to those it affects. TRC Bobcaygeon aims to create a space to look into the mirror together and learn with our hearts, our spirits, our bodies, and our minds. Next up, we have Peter Raymond.
So Doug is an elder, a historian, hunter, fisher, ceremonial leader, and a language keeper, storyteller, a past chief, and director of studies in PhD program in Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. Now, in the winter of 2015-16, the United Church hosted storytelling at the Bobcaygeon Public Library with Doug and Julia from Trent University. Doug has a deep understanding of Indigenous history and an innate ability to communicate orally in a calm and a very humorous manner. From these early days, Doug has been a mentor and an ally with TRC Bobcaygeon, and we've built a respectful relationship. TRC Bobcaygeon has had informative sessions at Kawartha Settlers Village with Doug Williams and Ann Taylor, with approximately 80 people in attendance. TRC Bobcaygeon has held reading meetings taking stories from Doug's book. The stories offer insights for settlers to appreciate Indigenous teachings, the culture, as well as relearning history that was never taught in the Canadian education system. Doug has and continues to be an advocate for Indigenous rights and treaties. He was heavily involved with the recent renegotiations of the Williams Treaty, and he reminds us, everyone, that we are all treaty people. I'd like now to welcome Sandy. Thank you.
The themes of relationship and interconnectivity are central to what TRC Bobcaygeon is all about. The hands represent so many people that are important to us. This includes relationships inside and outside our group, as well as the ones we wish to nurture as we continue to reach out. The 4 trees represent our reestablishing our relationship to the land. In settler society, people commodify the natural world, referring to land as resources. Through our workshops, we are learning how important Indigenous knowledge is for the well-being of the planet and for our future. The circle is a metaphor for me of the way we are trying to bring wholeness to how we relate to each other. We start every meeting with a sharing circle. Everyone in the circle has a voice, and we recognize the value that each voice contributes. We operate by consensus, and we use the circle as a way to talk things through to an agreed upon outcome. We strive to bring this way of being to everything we do outside in the larger context. Finally, a word about the lines of interconnectivity. In our TRC group, we are both unlearning and learning. When one thing changes, it impacts everything else. As we work at decolonizing our thinking, we add new ways of being. We acknowledge that what we do is a work in progress. Join us as we find our way towards reconciliation. I'd like to welcome Anne.
Bonjour, Anine. My quilt square is my reaction to the report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirited, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transsexual, Queer, Questioning, Intersex, and Asexual people, which members of the Truth and Reconciliation community, Bobcaygeon, took time to read and discuss. I have learned that the Anishinaabe are the protectors of water and givers of life. They are sacred. Their roles are essential for our existence on this planet. Yet so many, too many, Indigenous women and girls' lives have been senselessly stolen as a direct result of colonization. And we, as a society, have been deprived of their gifts. Those friends and family that remain live with unimaginable grief. Yet remarkably, resilience still thrives among Indigenous women and girls, even in the face of this ongoing genocide. The images in my quilt square are intended to remind us of the fragility of our universe. The sun, the moon, and planet Earth intertwined in an unknowable universe, the necessity for interdependence, and the profound urgency for renewed respect towards Indigenous women and girls. I'd like to now welcome Elaine.
Elaine, could you unmute yourself?
Sorry. My square, you can see the gray stone wall with the arch. The settler community calls this land the Boyd property. The colonial culture is decaying. The walls have come down. It is once again open space. waiting for a more just relationship between settlers and First Nations. The bead shapes beside the arch represent sacred medicines, tobacco and sage. Could this metal be a mishkade? The buttons represent the story Doug Williams told about his grandmother selling baskets on Sturgeon Lake. She was given very little money for her creative work. Adding insult to injury, these people gave her used clothing from which they removed the buttons. Doug's response was to call them Mr. and Mrs. Button. To me, this is a painful example of how women, especially Indigenous women, and their culture are not valued. When Ann Taylor from Curve Lake led the strawberry teachings, she told us the story of two brothers. They fell in love with the same girl. One brother tragically died. Eventually, strawberries grew where the body was secretly buried. The lesson is when you bury the truth, have amnesia denial. All relationships suffer. A traditional part of the ceremony is to share the strawberries. I am very grateful for our TRC group and being included in these gatherings. We are learning to listen. The bear appeared in my dreams just as the pandemic started. In the Anishinaabe tradition, the bear is a healing spirit. Miigwech Makwa. And I will pass it over to Brenda.
So, what happens to our quilt now? As you can see, this quilt is woven with many different threads and stories. It is a beautiful piece of work, but it will not just lie on a bed or hang on a wall. Wherever we go, this quilt will walk with us along our journey. Whether on a water walk, at a workshop or educational, at Settlers' Day or on a march, we will carry our quilted banner to demonstrate our history and our commitment to the many themes. We see it as a powerful tool in continuing to build our relationships with our Indigenous neighbors. We want settlers to study this quilt, look into the mirror, read our stories, call on us, question us, and challenge us along the way. We want the quilt to help TRC members to decolonize our own thinking, to build on our relationships with each other and the larger community. Our quilt weaves together many crucial themes, from the Two-Row Wampum Treaty and our recognition that we are all treaty people, to the history of the Mishkade and storytelling, to protecting and respecting Manoomin, water, and the environment of this region, to celebrating that women are sacred and committing ourselves to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, to celebrating our relationship building through workshop with elders and our play performances of cottages and Indians, to respecting Indigenous knowledge holders, to recognition that reconciliation without relationships is not reconciliation, and lastly, the interconnectedness of all of our work. We believe this quilt and its background stories can be an effective educational tool for our schools and our communities, and we look forward to including it in all of our future work. So please, seek out the truth, join our workshops, help us to build relationships with Indigenous people in our region, and take action towards reconciliation. Help us negotiate the river as it curves around, symbolizing the beginning relationships between Indigenous and settler peoples, nation to nation, each traveling down the river side by side, as we saw in the original Two-Row Wampum Treaty. Our quilt is a moving image, documenting our history and commitment to challenging racism and forging new relationships in our region. Thank you, Miigwech, from all of us in TRC Bobcaygeon.